Socrates said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing that you know nothing," but I hope we can somehow move beyond simply nothing to answer what does it mean to be wise. So let's start with what is the difference between wisdom and knowledge?
Knowledge and wisdom. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's where a lot of people start, partly because Scripture itself talks about the differentiation between knowledge and wisdom. A couple of years ago, one of my students said to me that the difference between knowledge and wisdom is knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. I thought that was good. Good way of differentiating between, and I guess what it's getting at is the knowledge, the information, and then the application of that knowledge. Because wisdom is often thought of as how do I use this knowledge in my decision making in life.
Francis Bacon said, "A prudent question is one half of wisdom." So I hope with this question I have become at least half wise when I ask, how can a Christian today exercise wisdom in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, the thing I like about that quote from Bacon is that it stresses the importance of good questions just for living. I think living under the power of a good question that drives you, that propels you towards a sort of attitude of lifelong learning is fantastic. I used to tell my students when I was a secondary teacher that the best learning, the best students will come to class with curious questions, wanting to engage and to learn something. And that if they asked really good questions, I would reward them as well. So I think one of the ways that Christians can live their daily lives in a way that is wise is simply to be driven by a sort of a sense of wonder, a sense of cosmic wonder, wonder about God, about Scripture, about themselves, about the world we live in, and those questions can propel us forward.
We frequently associate King Solomon with wisdom, but which other key figures in the Bible are worth remembering in regards to wisdom?
Yeah, Solomon is certainly the great patron of wisdom in ancient Israel and in Judaism. I think three interesting characters that come to mind who all have something in common. Joseph, Daniel, and Esther. All three of them lived outside of their own context. They were displaced. So Joseph, obviously in Egypt, he rises to a position of great power and influence. Esther becomes the queen of Persia, and Daniel is in exile in Babylon. But all three of them are given this gift by God of discernment, of wisdom, some of them of interpreting dreams, and this ability to be able to navigate what is subtle and what is grey and what is tricky, and to be able to make decisions and then to influence people. And I think that's their contexts and their personalities and their character traits and things like that are fascinating to study in the context of wisdom.
In today's culture, we seem to see many materially wealthy people who apply wisdom in order to obtain riches and success. But in Proverbs 16:16 it states, "How much better to get wisdom than gold, to get insight rather than silver." Is there an incompatibility between wisdom and wealth, or is this concept of one or the other a relic from a finished era?
It's a good question. I think that wisdom and wealth, they're not necessarily incompatible or mutually exclusive. Both in Scripture and in my own experience, there are lots of people I've known who have been wise and wise in their use of money and wealthy. And I think the issue that the Bible raises in the Old Testament and the New Testament is one of priority, not one of a decision between wealth and wisdom. But when you have both, if you have both, how do you use your wealth? How do you use your wisdom? I think maybe one good example is in the New Testament when the rich ruler comes to Jesus and says, "How do I get eternal life?" And Jesus knows he's wealthy. He answers Jesus' questions well, so he's also got a sense of wisdom and insight into the Scriptures. And Jesus challenges him about the priority there. Go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor. And that's where the guy comes a bit unstuck. And so it's a sense of, I think, priorities. Where are you putting your faith and your trust? Is it in the wisdom or is it in the wealth? And what does it mean to be wise then? Does it mean to trust God? And again, it's a matter of where we put our faith.
The Old Testament contains 5 books of wisdom literature, but they're quite different in genre. What is the common thread that defines them all under the umbrella of wisdom literature?
Yeah, they are all quite different. You have a story in there, you have a hymn book in the Psalms, you have the Song of Songs, you have sort of a collection of cynical musings in Ecclesiastes, and you have a collection of short pithy sayings in Proverbs. And I guess what binds them all together in one sense is simply that they all talk about wisdom. They contain the words wisdom, knowledge, insight, understanding, and they quite explicitly are saying that those are the qualities that they are teaching, maybe with the exception of Song of Songs, that they are teaching wisdom. I think what they do, though, with it is interesting because you have these different genres and they don't address the issue in the same way. So Psalms and Proverbs address the issue by saying something quite similar to what the Pentateuch says. So at the end of Deuteronomy, you have the curses and the blessings for Israel, depending on whether they are obedient to God or disobedient to God when they go into the land. And so the message there is essentially, if you obey God, He will bless you in these ways. If you disobey, you'll be subject to these curses. And the book of Psalms, especially the Wisdom Psalms and the book of Proverbs, they stress this. They say this is what happens to the righteous, and this is what happens to the wicked. This is what happens to the wise, and this is what happens to the fool. But Job and Ecclesiastes especially address that question very differently, because Job is an example of someone who is righteous, there's no doubt about that, but he is not blessed. He is actually subject to the curses. And so you get this situation where the message is basically life is messy, and what happens when it's a mess? What happens when things don't go as planned or as I thought that they should, even according to Scripture? And so you get this tension between these different voices in wisdom literature, which I think is part of wisdom itself. It's fascinating, but it's communicating to us that we mustn't make things too simple. Job's friends, I think where they go wrong is that they boil everything down to a simple way of looking at things and say, you're suffering, you must have sinned. And that's their conclusion. And Job is saying, no, it must be more complicated than that. And Job is right.
How do we reconcile the fact that these texts on wisdom don't have the same basic message, and how are modern Christians meant to abide by what is set out in the books if they contradict each other?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that people often say about the Bible generally. Oh, it's full of contradictions, so how can I believe any of it? I don't think the Bible is full of contradictions, or that these different books of wisdom literature necessarily contradict each other, so much as they complement one another. And they present a perspective that is holistic, that is actually realistic, because life is complicated. It's a mess. It's full of different voices and perspectives. And to have a canon of Scripture that testifies to that and says, there are times where this will be true, and there are times where it won't be true, and this is how you can work that out in your life. This is how you can be wise and discerning and show your understanding. And so I think the wisdom literature is particularly helpful in helping us to negotiate that difficult, that tough terrain, those questions of theodicy. Is God all-powerful? Is God all-loving? Then why is the world the way that it is?
In Matthew 10:16, many translations point to Jesus' phrase, "Be wise as serpents." I'm curious about this association between wisdom and the serpent. They have a complicated presentation in the Bible. It was a serpent that got Adam and Eve kicked out of Eden, but we wouldn't say it was a wise creature. It was probably more cunning and deceptive. So could you talk a bit about wisdom and the serpent?
I think that's a fascinating story in Genesis 3 about the serpent. And you're right, there are a lot of things that story has to say about wisdom, in the way that Adam and Eve respond, in the connection between the craftiness of the serpent and the nakedness of the man and the woman, the vulnerability, because the words almost sound identical, crafty and naked, and they're juxtaposed there in a way that suggests that their vulnerability and the serpent's questions are going to lead somewhere, and they do. But yeah, that would take me. That's probably something you need to come along to the class to explore in greater depth. But I think in the New Testament, when Jesus says to his disciples, "Be wise as serpents and gentle as doves," it's important to remember the context. I mean, one of the first rules of biblical interpretation, generally speaking, is what is the context? What's the historical context? What's the literary context? What's the theological context for this story? And in that instance in the New Testament, I think in Matthew, the disciples are under threat. They're going out into a dangerous situation. And the first part of the verse is warning them that they are sheep in a wolf's world. And so being as cunning as snakes and being gentle like doves is a way of saying, be really careful. Use your noggin. Don't do anything that will just get you devoured by the wolves that want to eat you. But be innocent. Be beyond reproach. Do things well. Love those around you. But just don't get yourself into any trouble that you don't need to. So be cunning. Be crafty. It's kind of an ambiguous word, wisdom, in that sense, when we translate it cunning or crafty too. And sometimes we ask, why did God create the serpent who was cunning and crafty? But another perspective on that is that ambiguity is up to us, again, to discern how we're going to use our wisdom and our knowledge. Are we going to use it for good or for evil?
Finally, in your article, you wrote a bit about wisdom in old age, and most people would cite a grandparent as someone who is wise. Is it possible for young people to be wise? Can you have wisdom as a young person, or is it something you can only realistically gain with age?
Yeah, I guess that's where the saying comes from, he or she is wise beyond their years, because we do tend to attribute wisdom to someone who's a bit older. And I think what we're getting at is life experience. You could go to school and go straight through school really fast and learn a lot of information. And actually, I think that was my tendency when I was younger. I loved information and I soaked it up, but I had no wisdom, none at all. And I got to a point in my life where things got really difficult. And I went through a life crisis that actually taught me a lot of wisdom. And a lot of the stuff that I had learnt in theory and in abstract sort of ways came crashing down around me, and I had to piece it together again in a way that actually made sense of life. And I think that's part of what wisdom is. It's making sense of life as human beings live it, not just in theory or in abstract.